Hello and welcome back for another episode of Conversations at the Intersection of Cutting Edge Science and Spirituality. I'm your host, Jennifer K. Hill, here with you with Dr. Deepak Chopra and Professor Don Hoffman as we deep dive into a new scientist article that explores genetics and evolution. If you were with us last week, you may remember that we explored the idea, could evolution learn? And Don gave us some great examples of inductive learning, and we explored the idea of objective reality. In that episode, Don left us with some food for thought. He said that the further and further along that science gets, the deeper and the deeper that science seems to go into the idea of unification, as evidenced by Einstein unifying space-time. He went on to share, it was a quote by Nima Harkemi Hamed, where Nima speculated that the last unification that I, meaning Nima, can think of is the boundary between the observer and the system being observed. As we continue these conversations about evolution and what it means for us spiritually, scientifically, from a consciousness standpoint, I invite you to consider, what does it mean if the observer is the observed? And then today, we're going to begin by exploring this idea of move over selfish gene. Is there room for a selfish gene? We're going to explore the idea of whether or not kin, having similar DNA to another person, makes us more likely to evolve in a cooperative way with that person, or perhaps is it culturally based? So there's a lot that we're going to explore today, and I thought a great way to begin, Don, would be to ask you, since you've done so much research for your book and why evolution, the case against reality, why evolution hid the truth from our eyes. What are your thoughts, Don, on whether or not we've evolved to be cooperative or competitive? If we could start with that and then talk about this idea of whether or not genes are selfish and whether or not we're designed to collaborate or to compete.
Right. So the idea from evolution by natural selection in its current form is that it's the genetics that get passed to the next generation that are the important thing, right? So genes create bodies which have certain strategies, which then are going to either succeed or not in getting those genes into the next generation. And so from this point of view, it's the gene is sort of the central driver, which isn't to say that it reduces everything to genes. There are epigenetics and other things that are going to be involved, but that the genes in some sense are the real thing to focus on theoretically. It's genes creating bodies with strategies that will then maybe get genes into the next generation. That's sort of so it's not about genes being selfish in any human notion of it. It's rather that this selfish gene is just a shorthand for that kind of idea, which has turned out to be extremely powerful. Now, in terms of what it means in terms of cooperation, right, among people, it turns out that there are, it's not simple. There are many strategies that genes can code into human behavior and social behavior of other animals. So one kind of strategy is to cooperate if others cooperate and not cooperate if others don't. I mean, there are lots of strategies like that. If you do something good for me and I find out that you're the kind of person who's going to do something good for me, then it might be in my best interest to reciprocate, right? So there's a sort of a reciprocal kind of, and so there's been a lot of work on that. It turns out that it's really non-trivial. There's all sorts of different strategies about how you can develop cooperation versus defection and so forth. And it's quite complicated. That does seem to be playing a role. When we do take people and put them into experiments, we find that these strategies come up. But there's another kind of altruism that gets programmed into us. And one really interesting example is the Belding's ground squirrel. So these are squirrels live out in the plain, and they pop up from their holes, they look around and so forth, but they cooperate in an interesting way. if there's some bird of prey, like a hawk or something like that coming along, or maybe some coyote or whatever animals want prowl on the ground, one of the squirrels that sees it first will send out a warning call. Now, that is an altruistic act because what the squirrel is doing is saying dinner is right here, right? It's giving attention to itself. So it's putting itself at risk. But in so doing, it gives the other ground squirrels a chance to run for cover. So you can ask how do you explain this, right? How do you explain a gene, a genetic program that could kill the bearer of the program? And it turns out this is where the selfish gene idea comes in. And that is that if that gene is shared by all the other squirrels or a large number of them, then the gene could sacrifice one squirrel, but increase the probability that the other squirrels with that gene will improve. And so that's how you can actually get altruism coming out of a selfish gene. But what's interesting about it from the evolutionary point of view is that when you do it that way, notice that altruism from this point of view is really the gene saying, I'll be happy to sacrifice you, the organism, the squirrel, so that I, the gene, can get into the next generation. Of course, there's no explicit saying this, but that's the logic.
Well, I have to stop you right there because they get into this in the article, Don and Deepak, as you know, you've read the article about the Good Samaritan principle. It's one thing when we're talking about squirrels, and what you're just talking about is this idea of, I believe it's called kin selection. Obviously, if I'm part of a pod or whatever you would call it of squirrels, and we all want to survive, or if we're dolphins and we're all fishing together, obviously we might have similar genes that we want to propagate to for the survival of our species. Where does the Good Samaritan principle come in? I would love to know your thoughts and then throw that over to Deepak as well, because the idea of the Good Samaritan, I'm walking down the street, I see a starving person, you buy them food. What is the benefit of that? And we don't even have to get into pathological altruism, but let's just focus on the Good Samaritan for right now.
Well, for kin selection to work, you have to be able to figure out who's genetically related to you, right?
Hmm.
And the interesting thing is we can't see people's genes.
Hmm.
So this theory requires then that the genes somehow have coded in the organism the ability to use clues
Hmm.
to figure out who is closely related. And so a colleague of mine, Larry Maloney, and some of his research colleagues have actually studied how is it that we can look at people and see relatedness. And it turns out we can. And
Hmm.
they've discovered features of the face that we use to discover relatedness. And so we're built, again, it's probabilistic. You're not 100% right, but you can guess who's related. And this seems to feed into this kind of altruism. It's also on the flip side is fascinating. Another thing about close kin is you don't want to mate with them, right? You don't, incest is really bad genetically. And again, how do you know who's really close genetically? Well, it turns out there's a simple algorithm. When you're born, anybody that you have seen since childhood, you just assume it's an algorithm that's sort of built in that they're probably related to you. And so you're just formed to have disgust, the reaction of disgust at the very idea of sex with someone that you've known for a long since you were an infant. And this makes a clean prediction that older siblings will have less of a disgust reaction to the idea of incest, of sex with a younger sibling than vice versa. And that's been tested and
Huh.
it works. So for this kind of kin altruism or kin select, preference for kin, since we can't see the genes, we have these algorithms that are built into us for us to guess probabilistically who the kin are. And it's really cool. So it's a very, very deep and fun area. But I should let Deepak say something.
Deepak, please share with us your wisdom on, what are your thoughts from an evolutionary standpoint? Are we designed first to, collaborate and cooperate, or are we designed by natural selection to compete with one another?
So, this is a very difficult discussion for me, but I'll try to see where we can bring Eastern wisdom tradition ideas, genetics, epigenetics, and what we call whole systems biology these days into maybe a proposition that we can explore together. Okay.
Fair enough.
So let me start with this science part of it. Having said that we're going to start with the science part of it, and having heard the science part from Don, um, let me start by saying I'm not a geneticist. I'm an internist, neuroendocrinologist by training. And I'm, of course, very interested in what these days we call whole systems biology or whole systems medicine. We started, initially it was called alternative medicine, then holistic, whatever. There are so many words, integrative medicine. But right now the fashionable word is whole systems biology. So given that, and I've heard very carefully following Don what he was saying, and he's totally 100% giving us the very crucial current scientific understanding of how genetics works, how natural selection works, all of that. And, there are many kind of interpretations of random mutations. Some people call them de novo, some say unpredictable. And, there are nuances of difference. And natural selection of what? Of traits for survival is how we look at evolution right now. Well, let me start with a simple example. I'm speaking to you right now and to Dawn at the same time. The genes in our nervous system are at the moment interacting with each other, okay, in order to create the whatever electrochemical activities in our brains. You have to activate genes. You can't do it without genes, right? Because you have to make neural networks, neurochemicals, etc. So we're doing that right now. We're regulating each other's genes, we're monitoring each other's genes, and we are being regulated by each other's genes. But there's more happening. I'm lifting my hands. That requires a whole another set of genes to be activated. Okay? I might be feeling some urgency in my bladder to go to the bathroom, which activates a whole bunch of other genes. I just had breakfast, so there are genes now involved in activating enzymes that are making my stomach food digested. There are genes right now regulating my blood pressure, genes regulating my immune function, genes regulating my endocrine function. All these have to be synchronized in their activity. In other words, they have to cooperate with each other just to keep my biology going. So the way we look at genes, and I've spent a lot of time with a geneticist, Rudy Tanzi. We've written 3 books. He's head of genetics at Mass General and Harvard. And so, the first thing we talked about are genes, nouns or verbs? And it's obvious they're verbs. In fact, there are no nouns in any biological system or anywhere. Everything that we think is a noun turns out to be a verb, turns out to be an activity. So genes are activities, and they're correlated activities in a whole system that we call a biological organism. Now, it also turns out that 65% of my genes are the same as a banana. 70% of my genes are approximately the same as a fruit fly. 80% of my genes are the same as a mouse. 99% almost my genes are the same as a monkey. So there is crossover. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to eat a banana. If I were to eat a banana, we share some of the proteins and the enzymes. So I can convert the banana into human eyes, human brain, human heart, human endocrine system. Given that picture, that's just the genetic picture. So in Eastern wisdom traditions, I'm not talking about non-duality, where non-duality where mind and matter are both symbolic representations of experiences in consciousness. In those wisdom traditions, there's no difference between mind and matter. They're the same thing. Matter is perceptual activity and mind is thoughts and imagination and emotions, and matter is perceptual, and they're all mental activities anyway. The matter and mind are complementarities of a deeper consciousness, which is regulating all this activity. So in that framework, if I were to go back to Vedanta, Eastern wisdom traditions, genes are the carriers of ancestral memory in that Eastern framework. And epigenetics is the modification of the activity of that memory for both recycling of memory and for imagination, for future evolution. In this model, which is a consciousness only model, evolution is driven by consciousness. Not only human evolution, but all evolution. And furthermore, evolution is an entangled web of genetic information, which today we call the microbiome. So we have the human microbiome here in the gut, in the skin, and the orifices. But underneath the surface of the earth, there's also the planetary microbiome of plants, of other animals, of other species. So if you collected all the manure of all the animals in the world, you'd have a pretty good idea of the genetic information that's responsible for life. Let me finish this argument and then you can ask me. So in this scheme, if I were to translate the scheme of Eastern wisdom traditions, genes, epigenetics, brain, biology, mind, perception, mental activity are a unified experience, period. And what you look at, so there's no me and the environment. Me and the environment is one system. The earth is recycling as my body, the oceans are my circulation, the air is my breath, stardust gave me the atoms in my body. So why do I call that the environment, and why do I call this the body? So in the Eastern wisdom traditions, there's no such distinction. I have a personal body, I have a universal body, they're both mine, and I can't survive without either. They're one unified experience, and it's being driven by consciousness, which is non-local, which is non-locally correlating these activities of genes in order to produce what we call the expression of sentience in biological organisms. And these biological organisms, sentient beings, are mathematically, and I'm using Western terms now, but precisely correlated with the activities of the ecosystem or the biosphere. So it is not the biosphere that gives rise to life. It is life that gives rise to the biosphere by producing biological organisms and an ecosystem of biological organisms that are together projecting the experience of what we call physical biological organisms, but also what we call the universe. This is all one unified, correlated, non-local phenomenon. And every experience we have in consciousness is actually non-local. We experience sensations. They have no location in space-time. We experience thoughts. We can say they exist in time, but actually you can't find a location in space-time for them either. We experience emotions, no location in space-time. We experience perceptions, hearing. You say, what is the location of a sound? What is the location of a color? What is the location of an odor? And the answer is not really, because all is experienced in consciousness, and in consciousness has no form. So everything is actually non-local. Locality is a concept. Physicality is a concept. And genes and epigenetics, these are symbolic representations of conscious agents. I'm a conscious agent. You are a conscious agent. Don is a conscious agent. Everybody listening to us is a conscious agent. Everything else is part of the projection of that conscious agent as mind, as brain, as body, and as universe. So as a conscious agent, Don is non-local. I am a non-local. Everybody is non-local. We are projecting as the scenery, space-time, the theater of causality, as we call it, but there's no causality, actually. It's the theater of causality in the theater of space and time, which Don has already said is not fundamental. It's doomed. So if space-time is doomed, then the theater of space-time is doomed. Causality is doomed. All there is infinite non-local correlation as consciousness evolves to higher levels of creativity, abstraction, experimentation, imagination, and it's a never-ending process. Evolution is a never-ending process. It will go on forever. That's what I have to say in response to so far what you've said.
Wow, Deepak, there are so many directions that we could take this conversation right now. And I think one of the things that I would love to do is give our viewers and our listeners a little bit of a concrete way to think about this. You know, I know, Don, in last week's or the last episode that we did, you gave some great examples of the jewel beetle and of a bunny rabbit not calling it a quadruped. And I think for today's episode, I always like to give people examples, concrete examples, which you gave the great example of the squirrel as well. One thing that came up for me when I was researching and preparing for today's episode was the idea of trees and plants, and how actually, Deepak, to your point, it's interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, because Darwin has us believing that, you know, we're all individuals and we're all out here, you know, whether you call us conscious agents or however you choose to define us. In the last episode, we said, you know, whatever you call matter is what matter is. So you can call it what you want, although what you just pointed to, Deepak, is so important. And that's the idea of the fact that there may be more to the idea of cooperation than competition. And if you look at trees or plants, for example, and I believe it's called mycelium. Are you guys familiar with the idea of mycelium?
Mm-hmm.
So for any of you out there who might not be aware, there's a great BBC article that talks about it back in 2014, explaining that plants all talk to one another through this internet, kind of like this fungal internet, communicating things, providing nutrients. I think it was back in 1997, there was a researcher who researched this with trees and found that trees, I believe it was, could share carbon via the mycelia. And the reason I bring this up, Deepak, is to illustrate and give a physical example in the world that's not really physical because it all stems from consciousness anyways, but an example that people can wrap their minds around, that we are all part of the whole. We are all part of the microbiome, and we bring life to the microbiome just like it brings life to us. So it's kind of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? How are we all interconnected? So Don, I would love to know your thoughts. You know, Deepak started to touch on the idea of symbolism and the idea that things are emerging as symbols. And I know from a conscious realism standpoint, we've touched on that before and the ideas on your book. Tell us a little bit, Don, about your perspective of what would conscious realism say about the symbols that we're using to create things and to explain the world that we live in.
Right. This is important because I think that people might be thinking that they're hearing some very, very different stuff. I mean, I was talking about selfish genes and genetic algorithms and so forth, and it sounds all pretty physicalist and reductionist and so forth. And then Deepak stuff sounds, you know, very, very often something a different tangent from that, and they seem unrelated, and yet I think that they're very, very deeply related. In the following sense, it's our theory of evolution by natural selection, which tells us, it's a theorem of that theory that tells us that our senses that are reporting a world of space and time and physical objects, that those senses are not telling us the structure of reality. They're only giving us an interface. That's where the non-locality comes in, right? When Deepak says we are non-local beings, right? Most of us think that we are inside space and time because we take space and time to be fundamental. And so we have a position in space and time. But evolution by natural selection says the very language of space and time is not related to the structure of reality. With probability one, is not the structure of reality. That's a theorem
No, wait a minute. Evolution from natural selection says that, Don?
That's in fact the papers that I published with Chetan Prakash and my other collaborators last year. We published 2 papers last year which proved these theorems. So that's why these things are deeply connected. It's a theorem of evolution by natural selection that space-time is not fundamental, almost surely. It's probability one. That's the theorem of that theory. So evolution by natural selection is not at odds with the spiritual traditions. What we have to understand is that the theory of evolution by natural selection, although it was first framed in a physicalist framework, right? Darwin was thinking about objects in space and time, right? Evolving. And then when we discovered genes there, we assumed that these are objects in space and time. But when we actually looked at the mathematical structure of evolution by natural selection using evolutionary game theory, that theory itself tells us that all these physicalist trappings that we've attached to the theory of evolution are not necessary. And in fact, we're wrong to think that space and time and physical stuff is fundamental. The theory of evolution tells us that we're wrong about that. Now, evolution by natural selection is also backed up by gravity and quantum theory. Together, they also tell us that space-time is doomed. So what we have here is not a conflict between science, evolution and relativity and quantum theory, and these spiritual ideas. What we have is science telling us. Now, the science is not telling us about spirituality. It's not telling us that. But what it is telling us is that the physicalist local framework, as powerful as it has been, and as wonderful as it has been, all the technology we've got is from that. It has reached its limit, and we need a deeper framework. Now, it doesn't tell us what that framework is. I, like Deepak, am very interested in exploring the idea of consciousness being this deeper framework, and then trying to get a mathematical model of it. The scientific theories don't go there. They just say space-time isn't it, physical stuff isn't it, but they can't tell us what is it. So as scientists, the next step is a leap, right? It's a fun, creative leap where we say, let's try, that's what I'm doing. Let's try consciousness. Let's get a mathematical model of consciousness and see how it would map into space and time. And when we do that, the way we'll check to see that we're not terribly wrong, I mean, we're probably wrong, right? But the way that we're not, stupidly wrong is to see, can we get things like genes? Can we understand where genes come from? So genes aren't the fundamental reality. They're just an image. They're just, a symbol. But a symbol of what in terms of consciousness? So what I want to do is to have what you were talking about, Deepak, be mathematically rigorous. When we talk about something in the realm of conscious agents corresponding to genes, I want a mathematically precise mapping all the way from one to the other.
So
Go ahead, Deepak. Yeah, please.
Respond to that. First of all, Don, I'd like to see those two papers. Can you send them to me?
Yes.
Because what you said is revolutionary to me, because I was not familiar that evolution or your mathematical theorems about evolution say that natural selection is guided by consciousness. Did you say that?
No, it doesn't say it's guided by consciousness. What it says is that the probability that space and time in physical objects is fundamental is zero.
Okay, so that you said, that you've clearly said, but you also said natural selection is not in space and time.
Right. Which is different than saying anything spiritual yet, right? So by saying it's not in space and time, there are lots of ways that you could take that aren't spiritual. Right?
Yes, that's fine. That lots of ways, but that's an important point. The natural selection is not in space and time. So send me those two papers. Now, this is what I'd like to propose, actually. See, when you make breakthroughs, you have to get rid of certain assumptions, and you also have to get rid of certain vocabulary sometimes, because the vocabulary is a reflection of our assumptions sometimes. So I would like to suggest, and this is something that Don maybe will be interest to you and your mathematicians, get rid of the words genes cooperative or competitive. Okay, because that gives genes an individuality. Okay, so get rid of that, because where we are right now, the individual itself is an expression of genetic information which is really entangled. It's not entangled in the non-local sense necessarily, although it could be. Genetic information of the planet is non-locally entangled in a whole system, which is a biological system. And in that framework, even the planet is a biological system with self-regulating feedback loops, ecological correlation, and all of that. So if we can explore a mathematics that eliminates this idea of competition and cooperation, but create a mathematics for a whole systems biology, is how is it, I get scared and right now my blood pressure goes up, my adrenaline goes up, my cortisol goes up, my blood gets diverted to, areas where it's needed, to my muscles. It's a whole system response to everything. Is a whole system response. I eat a banana, it's a whole system response. In fact, the other day when I was talking to Frank Wilczek, the Nobel laureate, he said, I can move or something, I can influence my biology with my private thoughts, but I can't influence yours. And I'm now maybe paraphrasing, but what basically, I can wiggle my toes with my thoughts, but I can't wiggle your toes with my thoughts, right? And so this is a dilemma for scientists. But actually, it's not. Every time I speak to you, I'm wiggling molecules in your brain and in your biology. You're doing the same with me. And in fact, from a whole systems point of view, every time I lift my hand, I change the space-time geometry of the entire universe. Entire universe, just by vibrating these vocal cords. If I'm looking at it not from an individual's point of view, but if I'm looking even at the individual as part of the scenery. So last time when we were saying the observer is the observed, obviously the observed and the observer are a tangled, unified activity. We say the observer is somewhere in here, can't be found. We say the observer is somewhere there, or the observed is somewhere there, can't be found either. So where is the action happening? Where is the observer and where is the observed? I think one thing we can say, that the observer, whatever it is an activity of the total universe. Right now, you have to have gravity, electromagnetic waves, and all those constants in the right proportion for this biological observer to be there. You also need all those constants for that scenery to be there. So it's the same activity that is producing the observer and the observed. Same activity, whatever you want to call it. The universe, force fields, gravity, electrons, charges. The other day, Frank Wilczek said the three fundamentals of matter are just three: spin, charge, and mass. And then he further said they are structureless points. How can you have a structureless point? But he said these are just structureless entities where these activities, charge, spin, and mass, reside. That's almost coming to say the charge, spin, and mass are not material entities. They're the things that give wings to those equations so those equations can fly. You see, I asked him, what gives wings to those equations? The equations themselves don't create this biology. It's the movement of those equations and the correlation of those equations that gives us this activity that we call the biosphere or biology or an ecosystem. So if we want to pursue a new mathematics, maybe create equations for what is the knower, who's the observer, what is the mode of knowing, and what is the object known. Because knower, mode of knowing, and that which is known are all entangled in this web of conscious agents.
So true, Deepak. And it's so funny what you're saying ties into the idea of speaking with somebody about this earlier today, is that if you look at the organelle that's, makes up our cells and how it is a composite of us as a whole, or the world, as you said, is part of a whole, or the universe, it all has the same properties and everything is the same because it's the observer and the observed are all interconnected. The question I have, though, I was reading a book, Deepak. I was talking to Dawn about this, and I would love to get this question answered if you guys are game. Is if this was a book that was recently referred to me called Beyond Darwin, that puts forth the hypothesis that the world is basically a computer program, which in some ways is similar to Dawn's theory on consciousness being the basis for everything, and in some ways is diametrically opposed to it. My question is this, is he asked a question in the book that I hadn't thought of, which is if everything is random, random genetic mutations, etc., then how do you get mathematics out of randomness when mathematics are precise? I would love to know either one of your thoughts on that, because I've been confounded by that question.
I can respond and then let John respond. I'm just wondering, if you look at any biological system, which is the basic interest right now, because biological organisms are speaking to each other at the moment. If you look at biological system, when you go to medical school, the first lesson is homeostasis or self-regulation. First lesson, okay, which is feedback loops and how these feedback loops correlate with each other. There are feedback loops for every activity in the body. Okay, so self-regulation, homeostasis, and self-organization is a given in biology. Except nobody defines the self. What is the self that is regulating itself? That is never defined. But what is agreed upon is biological organisms self-regulate, they self-evolve to some extent over a period of time. They are self-correcting, like cybernetic feedback loops, and they correlate with each other in order to keep the whole system going. So the question for Dawn is, could there be a mathematical endeavor to look at what regulates a whole system? What regulates a whole system instead of this, that, what is the whole system is being self-regulated? What's the mathematics of that? Number one. Number two, current mathematics and computer programs are based on algorithms, as we know. But mathematics tells us something that Don is an expert on, and you also know about, Gödel's theorem, where there are these theorems that are illogical, but they're true. And they don't fit any algorithm till you put them in an algorithm. And so that leaves room for creativity, even in self-regulation and in new mathematics. So I'll stop there.
Don?
Okay, yeah. So, well, there's a lot of interesting ideas here. So I'll mention a couple. When I agree with Deepak that we want to have this notion of a notion of spirituality that's non-local and interacting conscious agents, and then try to understand why we see things differently in space and time. We see genes and separate bodies, and I wiggle my toes and not your toes, and so forth. So we really, as a scientist, this is exactly the kind of thing that scientists want to try to do, is to make things mathematically precise, right? So one thing I'm trying to do is to get a mathematical model of conscious agents. Again, of course, I'm going to be wrong, but the idea is to put some mathematical model down so that we can start to make mathematically precise predictions to propose how space-time emerges as symbols that arise out of the dynamics of consciousness. Why some of those symbols look like genes, why you look separate from me, why sometimes I feel hostility towards other people, and there's this whole separateness. Why does that come up? So we want a mathematically precise model of this. So the goal of me as a scientist, and I hope other scientists, will be to bridge this gap, but to bridge it without any hand waves, mathematical precision. Now, in terms of the book that you mentioned, Jennifer, the idea that there could be like automata at the foundation of
Mm.
physical reality, say, is an idea that Nobel Prize winner Gerard 't Hooft, who a Dutch from the Netherlands physicist who's brilliant, he's working on that kind of model. Stephen Wolfram, who is very famous for his work on Mathematica and the Mathematica package, he's also working on that with cellular automata kinds of models. So there are, this isn't, I wouldn't say, generally the point of view that physicists have, but these are both serious people. They are not dismissed out of hand. And so the idea that there could be some kind of automata machines at the foundations beneath space-time is out there. It might be mathematically similar at some level to the mathematics that I'm proposing for conscious
That's what I
aging.
was thinking. That's why I was really curious about that and what the differentiation is between that, a program versus consciousness, because consciousness is in some ways a program.
Right, and so the mathematics I'm working on is it's not specifically cellular automata like Wolfram or the kind of work that 't Hooft is doing. It's more dynamical systems that you can model probabilistically, dynamics on graphs using Markovian dynamics and so forth. And one might be able to find mathematical equivalences, but that what I'm trying to do is model consciousness as opposed to they're trying to model unconscious machines. So they're saying their point of view is that the foundation of space-time is just more mechanism, and we can build up from unconscious mechanisms. So they would still have the problem of how does unconscious mechanism give rise to consciousness, right? They would still have that hard problem. And of course, 't Hooft is a Nobel Prize winner. He's a genius. You would be stupid to bet against him. So I mean, and as a scientist, I'm happy for all different, let 1,000 flowers grow, and we'll see what works. I'm putting my money because you only have a short life, and you have to, as a scientist, you have to bet. You're betting your life, because you have a finite amount of time on what strategies you think will be the most interesting. And so I'm betting that a model that takes consciousness as fundamental and tries to explain how space-time emerges and why it looks like there are things like genes and it looks like we're separate and I can wiggle my toes and not yours. Those things would have to come out of this model, or I'm wrong. So that's sort of the scientific attitude about it. Is so my attitude is I'm all on board with what Deepak is saying about the non-local and spiritual. Just as a scientist, I want to take all those ideas, and I'm not happy until I have equations for every one of them. And I show exactly how, for example, I can use those equations to predict scattering amplitudes of gluons at the Large Hadron Collider. When I can do that, I'm not right, but at least I'm on my way. I mean, I'm doing something that as a scientist is now worth testing to find out where it's wrong.
So first of all, it's a great privilege, Don, that you are doing that for the whole world, because you're bringing together very different modes of thinking, what people call categories, categories of thought. And so we're talking about different categories of thought, and it's very difficult to bring them together. And since we were discussing earlier the cooperation versus competition, and you mentioned the squirrel example. So one of the examples in the body, everyday example, is what we call apoptosis, programmed cellular death in the body. So, every 5 days, the cells of the stomach die, so new ones can be born. Your immune system dies every 120 days, so you have a new immune system every 3 months, so on. Your skeleton recycles every 3 months, and every gene, every atom is different in 3 months from now. Right now, this is my 2021 model. The 2020 model is gone on the level of physicality. So when we see something like apoptosis, programmed cellular death, That is, the cell is committing suicide so that the whole system can live.
Wow.
The cell is sacrificing itself, just like that the squirrel, so the whole system can live. Okay, and that, in fact, from an Ayurvedic perspective, which is a consciousness-based biological perspective, programmed cellular death is loss of memory, and it is a loss of memory of wholeness. The cell has forgotten that it's part of the whole, and so it wants to live as an individual, and it becomes cancerous and it takes over the whole body. So cancer is the loss of the memory of death in this model. Okay, this model is a consciousness-based model which says the whole is important, the individual is just an transient activity of the whole. So apoptosis makes total sense in this model. There was one more thing I wanted to say about this, which is very interesting, is so if we get rid of these words, what is an individual is not, the whole system is self-regulating. If there can be a math for that, for self-regulation, for self-organization, for self-correlation, for self-evolution, I hesitate to use the word autopoiesis, but that's what it means, and then also get rid of the word different. Replace the word different with differentiation. Separation is not the same as differentiation. So the fertilized egg differentiates into the body: eyes, nose, heart, brain. But these are not separate activities. They are unified, differentiated activities. So if we can use, instead of competition and cooperation, use the word self-regulation. Maybe there's a math for that. And also not to talk about individual objects, but as differentiated objects, because what is an object out there as a physical object is actually a perceptual activity of consciousness. You cannot separate the physical object from the perceived object, from the mind, from the brain, and actually your mode of knowing. You are looking at that through a microscope. You're looking at that through a telescope. You're looking at that at the level of feeling, or at the level of imagination, of intuition, of creativity. That would be a whole systems biology. We're a very long way away from the math of that.
Well, there is some interesting work in my field that's related to this. There's a guy named Carl Friston and a number of his collaborators, but it's more than them, but they're some of the primary ones. They're looking at a free energy principle and a way of getting self-organizing systems. So they're looking at the development of systems of self-organizing, minimizing the Gibbs free energy and so forth. They show how we create these things called Markov blankets that are sort of the boundaries. So these are the boundaries between me that can wiggle my own toes and you that I can't wiggle the toes. So there's a Markov blanket that sort of is the boundary that gives me versus the others. And so this whole free energy principle and the Gibbs free energy and Markov blankets are a way that cognitive neuroscientists are trying to start to get at this self-organizing kind of aspect. So there's, I think there's a lot of work ahead. There's a lot that hasn't been understood, but I think the kind of thing that you're talking about is also being talked about by the scientists, and they're trying to build models based on the free energy principles. So I think that there's hope in the future that these ideas again would be made rigorous. And part of my goal in talking about this is, of course, we're trying to bridge between science and spirituality here. And I don't think the two have to be at odds. I think that there are wonderful ideas from the spiritual side that scientists are starting to get hints about the same kind of thing from a scientific physicalist kind of framework. And as we collaborate and talk, we can try to take the insights from both and eventually get a mathematically rigorous combination so that we can really go all the way from science to what we call the physical world, from spirituality to the physical world, in a way that we really understand the whole and understand that there wasn't a separation in the first place when we get the new mathematics.
I would
think
love to nominate you and Deepak to write a book
Jennifer,
together. I want you
Jennifer,
guys to write a book together on the
no,
integration of the book.
Jennifer, we've been going for an hour, so we should
Yes.
probably conclude. I'd like to suggest that we call today's talk Conscious Realism, Move Over Selfish Gene. How's that?
Move over selfish gene. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of neither here nor there, but it's food for thought, right?
Awesome. Conscious realism, move over selfish gene. Brilliant, Deepak.
Okay, so now on the idea of a book, let's just keep collecting this. And at some point, this, I will send it to if we have a transcript of this, we can send it to my agent who created the book with Leonard Mallardo and also with Rudy Tanzi and also with Menas. But let's put that somewhere in the back burner if John is amenable to it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
I just want to I want to read that book because I just following you guys. It's always so interesting to go back and rewatch the episodes, and I love the integration of the science and spirituality.
At some point, let's get the transcripts too, if we can. Okay.
Absolutely.
Actually,
Let's do it, guys.
Google can do the transcripts for us. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. It was a
Next
pleasure.
time, adapt first, mutate later. How's that?
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Sounds great, guys. Have a great week.
Take care.